I'll just briefly share some of the objectives of today and what we want to focus on in our conversation. Firstly, we want to share some insights from the extensive research that we've been doing in the medtech industry, specifically some benchmarking with medtech executives such as yourselves and your peers, as well as some research that we've conducted with your customers, so with surgeons, hospital administrators across the globe. Secondly, we are going to focus today on describing some of those future models and sharing our perspectives on how we think customer engagement will transform in the industry, especially post-pandemic, as we've been talking about the last couple of days. And finally, we'll make sure to focus as well on how we believe medtech companies should overcome some of the typical challenges and take the right steps towards transformation. So today, I think we really want to make sure we focus on the actions and the solutions and how we think we should be making progress towards evolving or transforming our customer engagement. I think we all believe the case is there. So really, this is about how do we make it happen. So I'll just start with a few trends. I mean, obviously, the context of today's conference is post-pandemic, but really there are some long-standing trends that are impacting the industry. In pre-pandemic times, most of our companies in the industry enjoyed continued success, really, despite some of these trends. But we've seen the pandemic being a catalyst to action, and we're really seeing momentum like never before to address some of them. And we're hearing that over the last couple of days on the conference and, of course, in our other conversations with leaders in the industry. So just a quick summary of those trends. The first one is the definition of our customer is changing. So we've got more and more non-clinical stakeholders important in the decision, and we've got much more complex upstream patient journey, referral pathways, and so on that we're trying to grapple in the industry. Secondly, if the pandemic has taught us anything, it's taught us that customers are engaging differently than before. But we know that they're not satisfied. So they're adopting digital channels. We can see that. And we know that they want more than just a rep-only sales model. So really, as we think about post-pandemic customer engagement, it's not just about when can we get our reps back to the customer. It's about how can we best serve the customer the way they want to be served to drive customer satisfaction. And finally, there's still productivity pressure on us as an industry, pressure to drive efficiency and effectiveness of our commercial investments, and also to make sure that customer engagement and support model is as differentiated and value-adding as it can be, as a kind of best-in-class part of what we offer to our customers. So those are some of the big trends that are kind of setting the background for further customer engagement transformation. I mentioned that we conducted some customer research with surgeons, with implanters, with hospital administrators. And here's the first set of things that we found is no surprises here, that the majority of customers are engaging very frequently with alternate channels. So virtual interaction, digital channels, and so on. And we know that a plurality of those customers expect engagement to continue to increase and diversify across digital channels. So more than half of our customers expect virtual interaction is going to increase in the next 2-3 years. Likewise, clinical support and training is also expected to continue to diversify in the future. And we know that digital engagement is high and customers expect that to continue to expand. It's important to recognize customer preferences differ, and we need to make sure that we provide that engagement model that works for different customers, but also recognizing that the rep model has always been a part of our success, and it will still be a high value part of what we do. So really we need to think about how can we use digital and other channels to engage in addition to what we're already investing in commercially with our field organizations. The second big set of learnings from our customer research was around customer satisfaction. So our survey was showing that customers are not particularly satisfied today, and most medtechs are not doing a good job leveraging alternative channels to create an improved customer experience. So even when we look at face-to-face interactions with medtech representatives, only about half of customers are satisfied with that today. And then when we look at our alternate channels, so virtual or digital channels, we see satisfaction levels are even lower than that. So there's a significant opportunity here for us to improve that customer experience. And we believe that medtech companies who take that challenge will be able to create much greater differentiation compared to their competitors, drive increased customer satisfaction. And so the question for the audience here is, well, what do you think your opportunity could be? If you could drive that differentiated engagement, drive that step change in customer satisfaction, what would that mean to you? So we'll explore that theme a little bit more today. I'll just move into the definition of what we think customer engagement is. I think we're often hearing the term omnichannel, and customers and companies focusing on engaging customers in an omnichannel way, so engaging across lots of channels, aligning what we do to customer preferences. And sure, that's part of the solution, but it's our view that the customer engagement includes omnichannel, but it's not only that. We really think that it's first about prioritizing the high impact models and picking the right approach that works for the business, and then preparing to solve for that use case in depth. And we think that it's not about throwing a bunch of content into a bunch of channels and seeing what sticks, but being very deliberate about the way that we use our different channels to drive specific strategic objectives, and ultimately use that to drive incremental effectiveness and incremental revenue. So that's kind of how we see the future model of omnichannel. Now, sounds great. How do we get there? What are the steps we need to take to build that? So we see a few sequential steps that many medtech companies are taking today. To start with, it's fair to say that most of us in the medtech industry have had to start from a point of relative skepticism about alternate channels, especially given the historic strength of our field-based sales channels. So we're at this kind of dabbling stage where there's very limited investment, and across the industry, many companies are still here, relatively little investment, really not much impact, and certainly heavy skepticism about the opportunity. I think we see other companies starting to take those first steps. So emerging uses of omnichannel, and here investment does still tend to be relatively limited. Digital is probably still seen as a kind of secondary enabler of what we're doing, or a way to kind of provide some additional touch to assist the field organization. And again, the use cases tend to be very limited still. Investment tends to remain quite low or disconnected. And so we still aren't really seeing that kind of business case to drive further investment in many cases, because we haven't fully kind of seen the power of what omnichannel could do for us. Beyond that, when we look further along the maturity spectrum here, what we start to see when we think about best in class and elsewhere in other industries, we start to see this kind of expansion and transformation of customer experience. And this really requires a few things. It requires focus on specific use cases for omnichannel. It requires leadership alignment around what we're trying to deliver with these different channels. And it requires some level of culture and mindset and capability shift as well. But ultimately, through that kind of expansion and transformation, what we see is that the investment and that focus drives additional investment and momentum, because we can build the business case, we can measure the return on investment of what we're doing, and ultimately create long-term value. So I mentioned that we had done some benchmarking of execs in top 30 med device companies in the industry. What we found was fairly consistently across the execs that we spoke to and the commercial leaders that we spoke to, is most companies really are in the kind of left-hand side of the spectrum, as I mentioned. And really, there was quite a few similar challenges that emerged across the group. So just in summary, kind of what's holding us back today is we're still in this kind of dabbling or emerging stage. A few things. So there's not really alignment on what the use cases are for the business. It's sometimes hard to demonstrate the business impact, as I mentioned, especially when the investment is limited. Secondly, the organization setup and capabilities don't necessarily enable us to do what we want. And on the back end, a lot of times we've invested big in technology, significant investment, but those investments perhaps haven't been adopted because perhaps they were built in a way that didn't really fit with our commercial strategy or with our customer reality at the time. Finally, often our data is a mess. We lack the analytical horsepower to be able to pull all of that data together and use that analytics and insights to leverage the technologies at scale and drive an impact. So a very consistent set of challenges that we're observing across some of the major players in the industry. We also asked some medtech leaders around what their aspirations are for the future. And here again, very consistently, we heard, at least 80% of medtech executives are planning to be in this kind of expanding or transforming stage in the next 2 to 3 years. So it's a major priority for the industry and for those who lead it, but so far very few have figured out what that recipe for success really looks like. So we'll talk about that now. How do we believe we should be expanding and transforming customer engagement? I think the first thing to emphasize here is this challenge is not to think about how do we invest in more technology or different technology, but really to think first about how we define the use cases. Where do we need to focus to drive impact for the business? Once we've done that, then we need to think about how do we build the right capabilities to make it successful. And thirdly, driving implementation in depth, which I mentioned before. So this isn't about a kind of agile or fail fast mentality here as much as really focusing on driving implementation in depth, improving that success, and proving that we can generate a business impact. And of course, hand in hand with that is the fact that we're measuring what that impact is across channels and using that to build further momentum for expanding our kind of omni-channel approach. So today we're going to focus mostly in the first two buckets here. So how do we pick the right use cases? And then how do we build the right capabilities to enable that? So I'll talk a little bit more about the use cases now. So when we think about the industry and we think about how to apply omnichannel, the first place that we could look is, well, what's been tried and tested elsewhere? Unfortunately, lots of the experience that has been built in other industries like pharma or B2B have been solving for oftentimes a relatively clear need, customer need, in the context of a relatively simple or homogeneous customer landscape. Whereas when we think about medtech, we know that our industry is so unique, our customer universe is so diverse, the buying processes and influence patterns can be so unique to each of our businesses or devices. And we know that the face-to-face model has been important and will continue to be important in the future. So really that presents us with a challenge because it's not possible to simply lift and shift what's been done elsewhere and apply that into the medtech industry. So we believe that, as I said, successful application of an omnichannel approach is about picking the right place to focus and really doubling down on that. So it's not like there's a one-size-fits-all solution here. Broadly speaking, we can identify two sets of archetypes for different models that could work in the industry. So the first one is really around driving effectiveness and augmenting our core field sales models. So augmenting the core. So that could be building additional channels to support what we're doing with the field team. Or it could be thinking about how we use alternative channels to drive promotional impact for our highest priority products and product launches, for example. Or it could be thinking about how do we transform our service model, our clinical support, clinical training, that kind of model as well. Now, thinking back to some of the topics that were shared in some of the talks earlier this morning, that kind of really fits in that augmentation space. The other set of archetypes here is really about how do we expand beyond the core? How do we drive scale or efficiency beyond where we've typically focused? So that could be a few things. That could be funnel activation or lead generation as we think about, early in the sales funnel. It could be how do we support market development or how do we drive referrals from office-based or community HCPs into our hospitals, into a implanting account, for example, or a procedure account. Or it could be around driving efficiency or scale of some of our promotional activities. So broadly speaking, those are the two major archetypes. So augmentation or expansion. Our benchmarking of leaders in the industry highlighted about 75% of leaders believe that the focus is going to be on 3 or 4 of these use cases at the top here. So either around augmenting the customer experience around the field or focusing on using omnichannel to support high priority products, or alternatively using it to build the funnel, build lead generation, or support market development. We see a lot less focus down in the bottom half here, and perhaps for 2 different reasons. We've had some success stories this morning around transforming training, transforming clinical support, but there's still some fairly major challenges to how we would successfully shift that model, which has always relied so heavily on in-person in the past. On the right-hand side, the efficiency challenge tends to come up less amongst leaders because oftentimes the primary objective here or the background is not really about how do we reduce or replace the sales force. As I mentioned, we know that the field organization is going to continue to be very important. And so that kind of efficiency question tends to come up a little bit less often as we think about where the focus is. So I've highlighted a few use cases here. We're going to spend about 10 minutes or so just talking specifically about some of those use cases and how to apply those in our industry. So it's important to note that in each of these case studies, each company that we're going to highlight here is using Omnichannel very differently. Using it to drive, as I said, drive a specific business objective, solve a specific challenge for the business. And it's very, very uniquely adapted to the business model at hand. So although some of the capabilities I'm going to describe will be similar across the different case studies, it's important to know that those manifest very differently depending on the issue we're trying to solve. And so one of the big takeaways for us as leaders here is we need to very carefully design the strategy and design what we build in order to make sure that we're successful with it and that we drive impact. So I'll talk about the first use case here, which is a challenge that may resonate with many of you in the audience today. So how do we manage a diverse customer base at scale, especially when our field resources are limited? And so the opportunity here is to drive that kind of augmentation of our promotional model, focusing around high priority products. And so the company in question here had selected this as a place to focus their omnichannel energy. And so what did that mean in terms of the capabilities required? Well, for a start, it meant standing up new channels and new enabling technologies. So leveraging remote engagement, leveraging some triggered or automated email capabilities. So using new channels. Now, in order to use those new channels, of course, field team capability evolution became a big theme as well. How do we drive that change management, that behavior change amongst the field organization to be able to flex and adapt? Now, obviously, the last 18 months has really helped to accelerate that move with the shift to lots more remote engagement. But that was really a key success factor for this organization. Thirdly, there's obviously the depth and breadth of the content strategy here. So the more channels we're present in and the more dynamic that engagement model is, the more we need to rely on the marketing organization to develop and deliver a depth and breadth of content that perhaps we didn't have in the past. Finally, there's the question of data and analytics. And so as we start to engage across more and more channels, we're generating a lot more data. And so the challenge here is to be able to get that visibility of what's happening at the customer level. How is that driving engagement, and how does that ultimately link through to business performance and sales data? And secondarily, of course, to use those insights and use that analytics to drive coordination and drive orchestration for the field organization. So to help them manage at scale, help them know where they should be focusing at what times with which customers. So as I mentioned, the pandemic has really helped accelerate this particular change. And really now the challenge is around how do we optimize or improve this model based on the foundations that we've developed. So that's the first example. The second case study is somewhat different. And this situation here is all about how do we grow referral volumes and develop a market for a category leading device which is implanted in the hospital, but the vast majority of our patients today are managed in an office setting by PCPs or specialists in the office. And so here the business challenge is totally different. This isn't about how do we enable our reps to serve our implanters better. Really the focus area for this business model is how do we drive that market development and how do we drive referrals at scale using digital channels? So here, this is really about a kind of digital first strategy. How do we use online and digital channels such as web or email, webinars, and so on to engage with that broad customer base that's very distinct from our core customers in the implanting accounts? So again, here, there's challenges around content supply and modularization. We're trying to reach a very big customer base and have a relatively high touch digital model. We need to make sure that we can engage customers with relevant content that they are engaging with and interested in reading. Obviously, there's another big challenge here as well. As we think about driving market development, driving referral, we need to understand how this market works. And so actually one of the key success factors for setting up this strategy wasn't just to set up a bunch of additional channels and start firing out more information, but was to think very strategically about let's understand the referral pathway. Let's understand who we should be trying to influence and when and how. What barriers do they have and how do we overcome that? And then thinking about how do we use the right channels at those different leverage points to drive the behaviors we want. Now on the back end, obviously, there's also the same kind of data and analytics challenges and questions as well. They look a little bit different in this example though, because we're not looking at promotional activity that translates directly to sales. So in this example, we're trying to look at, for example, overall engagement across channels, measuring the level of engagement across various channels and getting a sense for how interested or how engaged is a particular customer in what we're trying to do, and using that as a proxy for potential or for good referral activity that will translate downstream. Analytics-wise, the opportunity here is around, using all of that data we have on engagement index to be able to optimize what we're doing, whether that's optimizing the customer journey, optimizing the sequence of tactics that we use along that journey, or to start to match the content that we deliver to the preferences of the individual customer. So very much an analytics-driven problem to solve here. And really, as we think about what's next for this company, it's really about how to get more sophisticated with the analytics to drive that digital activity at scale, but also to start to integrate that with what the referral team on the ground is doing in the customer-facing model as well. So to integrate what we're doing digitally with what we're doing with our in-person model as well, which is a really important success factor here. The third use case I'll just touch on briefly is really a different business problem here, which is around what can we be doing to drive a launch product successfully, maximize uptake, especially when we've got a very fragmented customer base. And so here the use case is really about how do we maximize funnel activation or lead generation. And so again, this looks a little bit different to the other examples I've shared so far. We're really starting to think strategically about what does that customer journey from awareness through to consideration look like, and how can we use our channels at the right moments to move a customer down that journey, whether that's email or web content or webinars, for example, but being very deliberate about how we use that journey. Ultimately, though, we're trying to make that journey end in a high priority lead that can be given to the sales organization so they know where to follow up. So the challenge for the analytics here is less about measuring engagement as an end, but thinking more about how do we use our analytics to start scoring leads, to know which customers are most engaged with what we've been sending them, and feeding that back to the field in the form, for example, the form of suggestions to say, here's your top 10 most engaged customers digitally. Here's where we think they are in the funnel. So this would be the recommendation around which customers to focus on as you plan for the launch. So the kind of technology model here is really around being smart about what we suggest to the field force and being able to help as marketers in passing the right leads across to the sales organization. So those were the three case studies I wanted to share. As we think across them, there's really four common capability building blocks that are coming through that I wanted to kind of summarize with. So as I said, although the capabilities manifest somewhat differently across the use cases, really these four steps are, firstly, being very specific in defining those use cases, defining where we're going to have impact for the business and building those customer journeys to address those objectives, and using the insights with the customers to help design that. Secondly is to think about the organization model, the capabilities, as I mentioned. That could be the marketing organization, it could be the change management and training for the field organization, but really making sure that we've built the organization that we need to support this and shifting those ways of working. Thirdly, there's the data and the technology that we need to support it. So making sure that we're not just generating a huge amount of data, but we're bringing it together so we've got a clear view of the customer and understanding how we can use the technology we have to drive success. Finally, there's the analytics and insights that we use, ultimately digesting that data, seeing what's happening, and using those insights to then create a feedback loop back to our strategy. So that's pretty much all I had to share today. I think, as I mentioned at the beginning, we've really focused on making sure that we select the right use cases and build the right capabilities to enable them. Of course, we know that the success and impact is going to come through focusing on driving implementation in depth, getting those early wins with the new models, measuring the success, and tying that back to business relevant metrics that can build a sustained case for investment. But that's really the kind of path to transformation that we see for the industry here. All right, I think we're close to time, so I'll turn it back to Matt, who can feed some questions that have come through from the audience.
Thanks, Will. So There's a question from the audience around whether we see a difference in the impact of digital engagement or virtual selling relative to more traditional models. Maybe you could talk about that in the context, some of the things you discussed related to use cases and thinking about the right metric to track, et cetera.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, obviously, we know that last year, the impact of our traditional in-person models was also heavily disrupted. So in the recent past, there may be some noise in the signals there. I think one of the mistakes to avoid here, though, is measuring the impact of digital in isolation. We need to think about where we're investing in digital, especially where that's overlapping with activities that we're doing in the field, thinking about how those additional channels ultimately amplify what we're trying to achieve with the customer and the metrics that we have for the customer overall. So less about trying to measure individual channels in isolation, but really thinking bigger picture about how are we using these different channels in combination.
Great. Another question that perhaps some people in the audience are thinking about, if we have a group of marketers, is if I'm a marketer, what do I do? What would you recommend?
Well, I think it's important to separate some of the strategic questions from some of the more tactical things here. But ultimately, as marketers, we need to make sure that we're focusing on enabling the strategy and driving that impact. We need to think about where we can have impact across the whole ecosystem here. And as I said, being very deliberate about where we choose to invest our resources. Focusing on those use cases and making sure that you drive impact on those specific use cases. At the more tactical level, I think there's definitely questions, as I said, around how do we evolve what we do as an organization, supplying the right content, proactively thinking about analytics and what we're going to measure, to the previous question as well, what we're going to measure to drive impact.
Great, maybe time for one last question before we close. Might be something on the minds of a lot of people is, hey, my technology is no good. My data is no good. Am I just out of luck, or is there anything I can do?
That's a great question. I think, we've seen significant investment in technology, all kinds of technology in recent years. And one of the things that we've identified is often that technology was built without necessarily linking it back to the specific use cases or the specific strategy. Now, that doesn't mean it's no good. I think often we find that it's not being used, but that doesn't mean it's unusable. And so one of the challenges early on is going to be reviewing the technology that we do have in place, perhaps working with IT or centralized functions that have helped to build that technology to understand how we can use what we have, even if it's in a somewhat limited way, but at least not starting from scratch or going in building some more tools and waiting another 2 or 3 years to implement a new system. But being very pragmatic about using what we have and trying to drive an impact. Same thing on the data as well. You've generated a whole load of data. That doesn't mean that it's junk. Often we find that by starting small and starting specific around trying to investigate what's in the data can often yield great results.
Great, thank you. Thank you everyone for joining our session, and feel free to follow up with any additional questions.